But of course, it would have the side benefits of protecting Ukrainian civilians against these ongoing Russian missile and drone strikes, and also doing something which Russia would definitely not like, and therefore demonstrating that there are consequences for behaving in this way.
Yesterday, 3 heavily armed Russian MiG fighters violated Estonian airspace over the Gulf of Finland. That's happened before, but never for such a protracted period of time. The jets were in NATO airspace for at least 12 minutes. The longest incursion before that was about 1 minute over Estonia. NATO scrambled its jet fighters in response, and Italian fighter jets were dispatched. The Estonians immediately invoked NATO Article 4, which calls for a discussion with member states when the territorial integrity of a country has been threatened. While the Estonian, European and EU response has been swift and condemnatory, Donald Trump expressed little in the way of concern. It looks like that is how it's going to be with Washington. This latest violation of airspace, of course, follows a breach in Poland. What exactly is afoot? Joining me now is Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow at Chatham House, Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia programme. Thanks so much for joining me, Keir. How worried should we be by this latest incursion?
Well, the honest answer is we don't know. There's nothing new in this pattern of escalation by Russia, and it was predicted very widely after the previous incursions in Poland that you mentioned, that if there was not a strong response that was distinctly uncomfortable for Moscow, we should expect more of the same, more probing and testing of NATO's responses, stepping up until Russia does find that response. But there's a lot we don't know about exactly how this incursion into Estonian airspace played out. There have been a lot of calls this morning for Estonia, or the Baltic air policing mission that was in Estonia, the Italian aircraft, to have shot down these Russian planes in order to send a message to Russia that this had to stop, in the way that, for example, Turkey did back in 2015.
Yeah.
But there was a great deal that we don't know about how this played out. For instance, you mentioned that these aircraft were heavily armed. You might have that from a reliable source. It's not something that I've seen reported elsewhere.
Right. No, I'd seen it in one of the initial reports, which said that they were armed with hypersonic missiles. I don't know if that's true or not, but and I don't suppose we'll ever find out, will we? It's also the case that
MiG-31s can carry hypersonic missiles. That's one of the main purposes they have been being used for in attacking Ukraine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were carrying them in this particular incident. It's one of the details that we simply don't know in order to assess just how exactly NATO could have responded, should have responded, or whether they actually did everything correctly.
Well, the pure denial from Moscow that the incursion happened at all, when, according to the Estonians, it happened, I think they first said 17 minutes in their airspace, and certainly we know 12 minutes in their airspace. Does that suggest to you that it wasn't something which had been directed from the Kremlin, or that it was simply a case of the Russians lying again?
We shouldn't pay any attention to denials of anything from the Kremlin after the very clearly established pattern of the Kremlin denying more or less anything. The Polish incident in the previous week was slightly different. There was a much more ambivalent response from the Kremlin, a slightly delayed one, almost as though they'd been taken by surprise, and then saying, well, we didn't plan to attack anything in Poland, which of course leaves open a wide range of possibilities of what they did plan to do, including sending these unarmed drones into Polish airspace. Here, though, it's much more similar to the classic Russian pattern of simply denying everything and pretending it didn't happen.
There were no consequences, were there, for Turkey when, and I think it was only a matter of seconds or a minute or so that Russian fighters entered Turkish airspace. They were shot down immediately, and there was not much comeback from Moscow on that, was there?
Well, there's a lot of mythology around this as well. Neither of those things are exactly true. It's true that on this last pass over Turkish airspace, that Russian Sukhoi 24M bomber was only there for a matter of seconds, but this was after a repeated pattern of infringing airspace and repeated warnings from the Turks that this would lead to an incident where they would be shot down. And in fact, they'd previously shot down Russian drones in the same area. So it wasn't out of the blue. It was Russia repeatedly testing its luck and then finding that feel its luck ran out. Also, there were severe comeback countermeasures from Russia against Turkey afterwards. There was a prolonged period of economic warfare. It ended up with a Turkish apology. But, and the key point here for people who are looking at this incident in Estonia, but there were no more violations of Turkish airspace in that manner because Russia knew how they would be dealt with.
Yeah, we heard a couple of weeks ago on this programme from a writer and academic, German academic, about the possibilities of World War III. somewhat worryingly, he cited Estonia and a Russian invasion of the very island over which those jets later flew.
Again, that's not exactly right. If you're talking about Kala Masala, he's not talking about the island of Vainlaw in the Gulf of Finland, which is where this incursion was taking place, in the airspace around that. Also, his suggestions of how exactly Estonia could be targeted by Russia have been questioned by people who are familiar with the terrain there. Now, I look into this quite a bit. My own book is called Who Will Defend Europe? But it's actually not necessarily the frontline states that are the targets here. Russia has been practicing delivering damage using tools like these MiG-31s and the missiles that they carry at immensely long distances. So you don't have to be a neighbor of Russia to be at risk from this.
No, indeed. What's happened now, of course, is that Estonia has invoked Article 4. There will be a meeting next week of NATO member states to discuss what action to take. It all seems drawn out and rather long-winded. Does it send the right message to Vladimir Putin?
It very much depends on whether action follows. Article 4, as you suggested, is just a means of saying, we have a problem, let's talk about it within NATO. But then if the talk leads to some kind of action that Russia is going to dislike, that's a great deal more meaningful. Now, people often ask why Article 4 and not Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the one that actually is supposed to trigger action by NATO member states. Neither the Polish drone incursion last week nor this incident actually meets the criteria where Estonia could be at all confident that they would have people on side. That talks about an armed attack, which is an incredibly vague phrase these days when there are so many different varieties of possible armed attack. But nobody would be calling Article 5 unless they were absolutely sure beyond doubt that they would be supported by other NATO member states and that this would lead to some kind of meaningful action.
No, indeed. Given that they will be meeting and that some sort of action might be taken, no matter how minor, two things that we've heard already. One is financial, which is seizing more Russian assets or using those assets to fund Ukraine in its war against the Russian invasion. The other one, far more controversially, was the creation of a no-fly zone over northern Ukraine where it borders the Baltic states or is close to the Baltic states. Do you see either of those as being either likely or useful?
Well, let's not forget this war has been going on for 3.5 years, and these suggestions for these countermeasures to try to reduce the risk to Western countries, to NATO countries from Russia, and also to invoke some kind of countermeasures against Russia to punish it for its war have been on the table the whole time, and nobody has yet taken these steps. So the question, of course, as always, is what will it take from Russia to actually move people to actually moving to these steps and doing it? That suggestion of having an air protection zone against Russian air assets over northern and western Ukraine in order to protect NATO airspace was resurrected again after this Polish drone incursion because of the problem that NATO faces, that they can only tackle these Russian air threats after they've actually crossed the border rather than before. But of course, it would have the side benefits of protecting Ukrainian civilians against these ongoing Russian missile and drone strikes, and also doing something which Russia would definitely not like, and therefore demonstrating that there are consequences for behaving in this way.
But it would also possibly draw Russian fighters into conflict with NATO fighters, wouldn't it?
That's been the primary objection to it so far, the risk that there might be some kind of direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, which is a slightly perverse argument if the whole point of this is to protect NATO from these Russian fighters and these Russian air threats. Now, looking at the way in which Ukraine's airspace is contested and the way in which Russian operations against it have been conducted, no, there isn't that direct risk if you are far from the front line of actually encountering Russian manned aircraft. Instead, it is shooting down these long-range threats, intercepting the drones, dealing hopefully with the missiles that are launched in some cases from well within Russia itself.
Right. Well, Keir, thank you ever so much for joining us this morning. That was very, very useful indeed. That's Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow at Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia programme.